The Warren-Matson Debate. Dr. Thomas B. Warren, Ph.D., is professor of the philosophy of religion and Christian apologetics at the Harding Graduate School in Memphis, Tennessee. Dr. Wallace I. Matson, Ph.D., is professor of philosophy at the University of California at Berkeley. This debate was held at the Curtis-Hixson Convention Hall in Tampa, Florida, on September the 11th through the 14th, 1978. We present the Warren-Matson Debate on the existence of God. The propositions for this debate are as follows. The first proposition reads, I know that God, that is, the God in the New Testament, who is to punish some individuals eternally in hell, does not exist. Dr. Wallace I. Matson is in the affirmative, and Dr. Thomas B. Warren is in the negative of this proposition. The second proposition reads, I know that God, that is, the God of the New Testament, who is to punish some individuals eternally in hell, does exist. Dr. Thomas B. Warren is in the affirmative, and Dr. Wallace I. Matson is in the negative of this proposition. This production was directed and videotaped by Dr. Rex A. Turner, Jr. and by Dr. Curtis A. Cates, administrators and professors of the Alabama Christian School of Religion, Montgomery, Alabama. This film has been copyrighted and reproduced by the National Christian Press, Incorporated. Any reproductions, use, or sale of this film without written permission from the authorized representative of the National Christian Press is strictly prohibited.
Please tell me if you can't hear me or all the things going. So Dr. Warren has handed me a couple of contradictions. Well, I hope I won't have to spend too much time with that. The first one is, he quotes, murder is not wrong because it is against any law. And the second one is, murder is unlawful killing. If we substitute from the second into the first, we get unlawful killing is not wrong because it is against any law, which so far from being a contradiction is a perfectly sensible statement. I'm not going to spend any more time on elementary logic lessons for Dr. Warren. The second one, where I said that I wasn't out to make converts, I might be wrong and I'd be damning somebody to hell. I was speaking loosely, I'll admit, and I apologize and I beg your pardon and I won't ever be modest again. But all I meant was, see, I'm speaking very lamely, as Dr. Warren knows. All I meant was that, after all, Dr. Warren's God was my devil. Might just possibly exist. I don't think so. But if he does, he's lying in wait for all kinds of people. And you can't be too careful. I'll take my chances, but I don't want to get anybody else in trouble. Dr. Warren says that doesn't think much of my statement. Can't you just see that it's wrong to gas all these Jews? He says, well, the Nazis couldn't see it. They thought they were doing good because some greater good than the evil of this would come of it. They were wrong, as I tried to point out. That's, of course, giving them credit for some kind of screwy kind of rationality. I wouldn't do that. I would say they weren't, and their followers went along with them, I repeat this point, mainly because they were Christians. As for the question of Nazi laws and whether the people who did these things were following their laws, I don't want to get into that can of worms. That brings up the Nuremberg trials. The whole question, why this is a difficult question, is that the Nuremberg trials involved what plainly are ex post facto laws, which are a very troublesome subject. Our Constitution forbids them, but they were apparently used there. And the complexity of that is something that I just don't think we ought to get into in this debate. Dr. Warren will probably badger me about that, but I'm not going to say any more about it. And if he wants to say I've given up, well, let him. I haven't, though. As for the eternality of matter and life from non-life and so on, Dr. Warren, I see, is in advance putting me out of context on this, but I'll deal with that tomorrow. Deterrence and reformation I'll come to. Communism. I think Dr. Warren is, he used the odium theologicum last night. Now he's trying to smear me with the communist brush. He's saying that in some respects they're better than I am, or better atheists, or more moral atheists, or franker ones, or something. I'm going to be brief about that. My view is that so far from communists being atheists, they are a religion and specifically a Christian heresy. And that view of mine is not idiosyncratic. I could argue it, but I think we have better things to do. I would just point out, in connection with this, that the only education Stalin ever had was in a theological seminary. Make that, if we're going to tar people with various brushes, we can use that one. All right, now I'd like to get on with my main presentation. This is the last 20-minute period I had for it. I was pointing out that God can't be omniscient and omnipotent and create sinners and also be good. I said that's so, even if we just rely on the moral evil we find around us in the world. But I said it's much worse than that because he goes ahead and punishes the sinners. Dr. Warren, I think, has tried to deal with this in advance, but well, let me go ahead. We're sort of out of phase. Well, God punishes sinners, and how he punishes them. With fire. Dr. Warren still hedges on this fire business. He can't really be a very good Christian and do so, but at least he's willing to admit that the pain is at least equivalent to that of being burned. The authorities I've read on this say that it's fire a million times hotter than anything on earth. And it's not for half an hour, which is the most that anybody, I think, ever took from the Inquisition, but eternally. Certainly any human judge who did anything like this would be forever execrated as a monster. But this is the God of justice, according to Dr. Warren. I think I'm going to dwell on this point a moment. Let's consider Judge Jeffreys and the bloody assizes. You know that story? After the failure of the Duke of Monmouth's rebellion in 1685, Judge Jeffreys was sent to the west of England to deal with the defeated people, who were mostly poor, ignorant peasants who had just sort of picked up a shovel or a hoe and followed behind these leaders and rebelled against King James II. Well, what did he do? He found them all guilty of treason. And what is the punishment of treason? He inflicted this ruthlessly and mercilessly. Punishment for treason is hanging, drawing, and quartering, or it was then. This is a process which I will try to describe to you. You first hang the culprit, but not until he's dead, just to give him a good scare and make it feel unpleasant. Then you cut him down. Then, I hope I have this in the right order, it doesn't matter too much. You rip open his belly. You remove all his intestines and throw them in a fire which you previously prepared. Then you cut off his genitals. Then you cut off, this is the quartering part, each of his limbs, one after the other. He's usually not still alive at that point, but if so, see, do you end up with a beheading? I'm not sure, but you get the idea. Well, what was done to these poor peasants who hadn't had a chance? It was thought, I think with reason, that this was abominable. And the memory of Judge Jeffries and the curses on him from friends and relatives of the victims have not failed to this day. But how utterly insignificant that is compared to God's punishments. For treason to the king, Jeffries sentenced a man to be hanged, drawn, and quartered. Well, treason to the king is a pretty severe penalty, and it was against the law. But now take God's law. For goofing off for 10 minutes and not repenting, sloth is a deadly sin. God will burn me forever. If that doesn't shock your sense of proportion, there's no use my talking to you anymore. Why, indeed, has anybody dared to maintain so monstrous a doctrine? The history is interesting and ironical. The only attempt to defend this in some kind of rational way that I know of goes this way. And I think Dr. Warren accepts this, but he can tell us. While the sinner is finite, sin, nevertheless, is an offense against the infinite being. So, nothing less than infinite punishment will do. How do you get to that conclusion? Why should anyone think that that's even an attempt at an answer? Only because this arose in the context where, in the common order of things, there were differential punishments according to the status of the victim. If you smote a serf, your punishment would be 2 lashes with the wet spaghetti. If you smote a free man, same kind of smite, you'd be smote back. Smiting a nobleman, 50 lashes with the cat. Smiting the king, drawing and quartering. So where does the scale end? Well, we go up to the infinite being, smiting God. And sin is smiting God. Eternal burning. Well, I don't think that argument would have much appeal anymore. It once seemed natural and fitting, but surely not in our democratical era. I guess we're all relativists now or something awful. The irony that I talked about, though, comes in when you reflect that this all depends, this idea of the punishment for sin, it all depends on a doctrine, namely this differential punishment for same offense. It depends on a doctrine expressly, and I would say also beautifully, repudiated by our Lord Jesus Christ in Matthew 25. I quote, "For inasmuch as you have done it unto the least of these, you have done it unto me," end quote. Which, unless my exegesis is just all wet, well, I mustn't even allow the possibility of being wrong, so I'll take that back, strike that. Which states that you shouldn't punish differentially, that sins done to anybody are just all equally bad. Well, stick around. Even worse is to come. Let's go talk about the justice of God. Human justice, we all agree, I hope we do, demands that there be some proportion at least between crime and punishment. We have just seen that there isn't any such in divine justice, at least the divine justice as Dr. Warren described it to us. He did say last night that God does proportion the punishment to the offense. And in a sort of way, this is done in Dante's Inferno, which is my least favorite classic, incidentally. But I've been unable to find any scriptural text supporting this, or indeed any Orthodox writer who doesn't say that the worst you could suffer on earth is a mere flea bite compared to the least you could suffer in hell. but I await Dr. Warren's citations on this point. Human justice also admits extenuations. In particular, it admits ignorance as an extenuation, or even in full, even get you off the hook completely in some cases. If you don't and can't know that what you are doing is a crime, you are let off. Not so with God. He condemns all the heathen, no matter how virtuous and no matter how impossible it was for them to have heard the word. He condemns them all to eternal torment. That is why missionaries thought, and I guess still think, of their task as so urgent. If they don't get the word out, how appalling will it be that all those souls that might have been saved will instead be roasted. This does great credit to their humanity, but I'm afraid it does little credit to their intellect in accepting this kind of whole scheme of divine justice, etc. To go on about merely human ideas of what is right, they usually require that punishment should have some purpose, ideally to reform the criminal, or at least to deter others. I say our ideas usually embody this requirement, for there are some who hold that evil, objectively, as they would say, requires retaliation, whether it accomplishes anything else or not. They have it coming to them. But even those who think this way commonly think that it is at any rate desirable that punishment should reform and or deter, and that if it can't, it ought at least to be moderate. I suspect that even Dr. Warren thinks this way when he is lovingly chastising his children, as he told us he did. And to take another example, you remember Tom at the end of Roots, when he has the Ku Kluxer tied up to the tree and completely at his mercy. And this Ku Kluxer has beat him literally within an inch of his life and done all kinds of other atrocities to him. He can retaliate, but he doesn't. Now, I think that most people who saw that thought that Tom was a highly moral person. For that, I think one of the points there was to make that he was a better Christian than this Ku Kluxer. But Dr. Warren, I guess, would have us that some requirement of justice was unfulfilled. So he should have beat him within an inch of his life. I don't know, I thought that Christianity preached forgiveness of sins and so on, but no, it doesn't. The punishment of God in the hereafter entirely lacks these features. It cannot reform. The authorities, all of them that I've read, unanimously are agreed that the damned souls cannot possibly repent by any possibility. Which, by the way, poses a very nice question about the sense of any in which the souls in hell can be said to be human, since it seems an essential characteristic of humans, according to Dr. Warren at least, that they have free will. Indeed, the saved are in the same boat. They can't sin, so they're not moral agents by Dr. Warren's definition. While we're quoting these things, I'll give you a direct quote from his book. Where is it? Oh, yes. Have atheists proved, etc., page 33. The possibility of evil is analytical to the definition of moral agency. That analytical is a piece of jargon. What he means is that you can't possibly, logically possibly, be a moral agent if you can't possibly sin. Which, indeed, he's repeated here tonight. Well, so the punishment in hell cannot be reformatory. I know that the threat of it is supposed to be a deterrent. That is indeed the reason why, until fairly recently, it was thought terribly wicked to raise any questions about its reality. Even people who didn't believe it occurred thought that, well, that's what you got to preach to the people to keep them in their place, keep them from raping and pillaging. However, I'm afraid that experience has shown quite conclusively that as a deterrent, hellfire is a very feeble one. Surely omnipotence could have thought of something more effective. If omnipotence needs suggestions, I might say that just a few twists in the human psychology, for instance, would have done the job. Would omnipotence not be able to do that? And if that's a reality, after all, he wouldn't be making us any less rational, quite the contrary. Last here, just about the most monstrous human injustice that it's possible to conceive would be a case in which the judge condemned a criminal in a case where the criminal was only an agent. The judge himself was the brains and the instigator of the crime. But this, despite his disclaimers, this is precisely what Dr. Warren's God does in every case. God is the first cause, the author of everything, consequently, the author of all sin and crime. I have already shown that Dr. Warren cannot escape this conclusion by appealing to free will. God created Manson, knowing full well that Manson would do what he did. He didn't have to create Manson, but he did. If I planted a bomb in this auditorium and it went off and blew you all up, it would be my fault and not the bomb's. And it wouldn't make a particle of difference if the bomb I made was a free moral agent, whatever that's supposed to mean. I have a few minutes left. I will use them to correct Dr. Warren's papers for tonight. I asked Dr. Warren whether it is possible for God to sin, and he replied emphatically, no. Well, I don't want to catch people in debating points, but I think that I am justified in referring again to the quotation I read you. The possibility of evil is analytical to the definition of moral agency. That is, it's built into the very notion. So, if God can't possibly sin, then by Dr. Warren's doctrine, he can't be a moral agent. It seems to me to be embarrassing. I went on to ask if he's not possible for God to sin, is he a moral agent? This is the reply. Dr. Warren's reply. He acts only according to his own nature, omnibenevolent, which you will notice is not responsive to the question, which could be answered with a simple yes or no. I asked further, if he is not a moral agent, does it make sense to call him good, benevolent, and so on? The response is, in the sense that he always does good, he is a moral agent. Well, then, this is redefining moral agent. So somebody who always did good, surely being God or being a human being has nothing to do with it, someone who always did good could, after all, be a moral agent. So these robots can be moral agents as long as they always do good, can't they? If Dr. Warren wants contradictions, there's one for him to mull for a moment.
Ladies and gentlemen, I'm happy to be before you again for the last of the 20-minute speeches which I shall have this evening. And before I take up again with Dr. Matson's speech and continue with the matter in which I was dealing with at the close of the last speech, which I had before you on chart 36U2, I want to put before you 36X, chart 36X. Does the atheist hold that these actions are really objectively evil? It was really a strange thing to me to hear Dr. Matson claim that the communists were not atheists. It is at the very heart and core of their doctrine. It seems to me that a mere tyro student on communism would know that they deny that a God exists. And it is a logical implication of their doctrine to do as they do. It is clear from reading their own philosophy dictionaries that they hold that what is right is what advances communism. And I'm sure that they would echo the words of my fellow disputant in this debate. Can't you just see that's right? And at this good moment, you heard nothing in this debate from Dr. Matson except a purely subjective position. He has given you no real reason other than the fact that he himself holds that it simply is not good that God would punish anybody. I want to show you something of the things that are going on presently in this world, and they're going on because of communism. Now, down through history, where we find people who have been religious, perhaps even to claim to be Christian, and perhaps have done things of this nature, it is not because of that, but in spite of it. Those who follow the Bible, those who follow the New Testament, are loving and kind and considerate of their fellow man, and they do not be guilty of what the Nazis were guilty of. And however much it displeases Dr. Matson to have this brought to his attention, that his doctrine allows no way actually to say that what they did was wrong, that given his view, the Nazis had just as much right to say we were right as the Jews did to say they were wrong, or that we Americans and the British and the Russians did to say they were wrong. I'm sure that you can see that he has no basis other than Wallace Matson. Dr. Matson, when we want to decide a moral question, what shall we do? Shall we come to you and say, will you please tell us just how you see it? So that you can say, can't you see that? So that we also may see it? But if Adolf Hitler had been there, he wouldn't have said that. But he ascribes it all to something like ignorance. It couldn't be just wickedness or evil, could it? These men were responsible for what they did, and for that reason they were punished. Not by the law of Germany, for that law did not say for them not to do it. Not for the law of England or America, because they were not under that law. But because of a higher law that men recognized. Even men such as Dr. Matson implicitly recognize that higher law, and over again he does it. I recall an essay by W.T. Stace in which he seeks all through it to try to create the impression we cannot really know there is God. And then at the end he begins to plead for men to strive for noble aims and great ambitions to do that which is good and right. I've never talked for an atheist with any time but what he contradicted himself along this line. But I want you to see what's going on in the world presently. On April the 17th, 1975, or according to Time magazine of July the 31st, 1978, on April 17th, 1975, various units of Cambodia's communist insurgents began entering the capital of Phnom Penh. Oh, Dr. Matson says, don't try to tie me in with the Nazis or the communists and their atheism. But he wants to tie me in with every theologian of every stripe he's ever thought of, down through all of history. Dr. Matson, I accept what the Bible teaches about Christianity. Surely you're scholar enough to know and demand of your students that they go back to the original sources in trying to write a paper. And I insist that when you're talking about Christianity, you go to the Bible itself and not some theologian, not even one as eminent and well known as Thomas Aquinas. Here we have atheism recognizing its logical import. After a few hours, the communists began to drive the 3 million inhabitants to abandon the city. All the inhabitants, including old and young, the well and sick, the dying, the maimed, the pregnant, and so forth, were herded out at gunpoint, stumbling, falling, and so forth, onto the streets and highways which led out of the city and into the countryside. And what is the message of Jesus Christ? Pure religion and undefiled before God and the Father is there, to visit the widows and orphans in their afflictions, and to keep oneself unspotted from the world. But the doctrine of this man, Dr. Matson, is exemplified in the actions of these communists when they recognize that man is nothing but a blob of matter, a very complex and organized blob of matter. But he has argued in this debate that man is nothing but the functions of the human body. And when that is gone, that person is gone. Here is atheism at its very worst, in its best in a way, because it's acting in harmony with its viewpoint. All the inhabitants of the city herded out. Sick people were pushed in their beds with IV bottles still attached to the bed frames. along the roads into the countryside. In some hospitals, doctors were forced to abandon their patients while operating on them. Thousands died along the road. Some died from loss of blood. Some died from exhaustion. Some were executed. Usually the execution, so time reported, was because of refusal to obey some Khmer Rouge order quickly enough. Now, friends, I'm telling you what is in harmony with this man's doctrine. Whereas in talking about these things of torture, he was talking about something to which I am opposed as strongly as anybody on this earth ever was. But this is in harmony with the doctrine of Dr. Wallace-Matson. Phnom Penh was not the only city in Cambodia thus affected. Time reported that the entire urban population of Cambodia, some 4 million people, were forced out on similar journeys. And let me tell you, my friends, that the educational system of this nation, both the elementary, high school, as well as the college university level, are being taken over by men of the persuasion of this man. Not all of them, but the basic thrust of the school system in America is now being dominated by evolutionary theory, which implies evolution. Atheism implies evolution. Therefore, ethical relativity is the absolute result of that. That's why I've kept before you that atheism implies subjectivity, and subjectivity implies a logical contradiction in morality. But a logical contradiction is false any and everywhere. Therefore, subjectivity is false, and therefore atheism is false. But this is why these men, as they come into this city, holding there is no God, that there is no life after death, that there is really nothing worth more than anything else in the final analysis, when you look at the import of the doctrine of atheism, they are now acting in harmony with that doctrine. Those who survived, so time reported, were put to work on 16 to 17-hour days, planting rice and building new irrigation systems. Many then died from dysentery or malaria, others from malnutrition. They were forced to try to survive on a condensed milk can of rice every 2 days. Incidentally, let me stop here and say something about the point that Dr. Matson intimated a moment ago, that Stalin's only education was in the seminary. Dr. Matson, were you so dishonestly trying to imply that Joseph Stalin was a follower of Jesus Christ rather than of Karl Marx? That is one of the most gross misrepresentations that I have ever heard in all of my life. Karl Marx was really the father of the thinking of Joseph Stalin, and it was why he was willing to murder, according to records which have been published, millions in that nation of his own people, as well as Mao Zedong in China. I don't know what results may be to me personally for making that statement, but I do know that it has been reported and will be, and I'll read right here below. Others were taken away at night by guards of the Khmer Rouge and were shot or bludgeoned to death. That's in harmony with atheism. There's no difference in taking a child with the heel and knocking his brains out against the wall or of stomping a cockroach. There is really no difference. They're both nothing but matter in motion. Estimates. First, the lowest estimate of the bloodbath to date by starvation, disease, and execution is in the hundreds of thousands. My friends, it is so bad that a man of the liberal viewpoint and pacifist viewpoint of Senator George McGovern has indicated that there ought to be considered some kind of invasion of that country in order to do something about the slaughter. The highest estimate is that more than 1 million out of a population of approximately 7 million have died. 1/7 of that population have died because of the doctrine of atheism. And it is reported that killing continues. Phnom Penh is now a ghost city. Time compared this outrage, which it indicated may be the most dreadful infliction of suffering on a nation by its government in the past 30 years, to the following of the Nazis' final solution to the Jews, something of the Holocaust which we saw on television, and the sending by Stalin and Mao Zedong of millions to their death. And I'd like for Dr. Matson to take these statements. The above events and their acts were really objectively evil, and if so, why? Something more than just your own subjective feeling about it, or those who were guilty of the above acts deserve to be punished. Now, do they deserve to be punished? Is there any element of retribution involved in this whole case? All right, I want to continue now where I was in setting out the positive elements of the Christian response to the argument from evil. I had stopped at proposition W3B on chart 36U2, where I had indicated it is not evil that there is evil. Now in Proposition W3C, bear in mind now that I am replying to what he has said in his representations of New Testament Christianity. Various theologians and so forth does not do it. I plainly recognize that God promises that he will do what he says he will do. He will bless the righteous, and he will punish the wicked. But the monstrous things that Dr. Matson has talked about on various occasions are not what the New Testament says. Let us note that evil results in every case from an abuse of the free moral agency of man. I'm talking here about intrinsic evil, that which is evil within and of itself, without any note of its consequences. Sin, violation of the will of God, this is the only intrinsic evil. Man may suffer because of something or other, and it may embitter him and cause him to turn against God, in which case he has been the victim of instrumental evil. Or he may suffer and because of suffering turn to God. I myself have recently undergone a great deal of suffering by reason of sickness. It helped me to turn perhaps even more strongly to God, to depend upon him more. I could perhaps have turned in bitterness and say, why am I suffering this way, as some people have done? That would be instrumental evil or instrumental good, whether it leads to obedience or disobedience to God. And it is not evil that there is that situation, nor is it evil that God tries to deter man from sin, or that he tries to reform him after sin, or that he will sin, or that he will punish him in a manner of retribution for what he deserves when this life is over. I asked Dr. Matson to tell us a moment ago how he could decide, granted the hypothesis which he regards as counterfactual, that what sin should have by way of punishment, if indeed God exists and man survives physical death. How does he know what sin should be? The only way he could know is that God would tell him. Proposition W4, it is not the case that good is opposed to evil in such a way that a good thing always eliminates evil as far as it can. This is to say, to oppose this is to say that the very moment anything happened evil, God would obliterate it. But this is simply not the case. God can be good and allow man to be free and operate freely, and to do wrong and even to blaspheme, to say things against God, to murder, to rape, to lie, to steal. God is not willing that any should perish, but is long-suffering to you. We're not willing that any should perish, but that all should come to repentance. Proposition W5, it is not the case that there are no limits to what an omnipotent thing can do. It is perhaps better to simply say that there are some things which are not subject to accomplishment. God can do whatever is subject to accomplishment, but he will do only what is according to his will. But some things cannot be done. Proposition W6, it is not the case that a good omnipotent being eliminates evil completely. God allows the world to continue with man with freedom. And therefore there is intrinsic evil, there is instrumental evil. Proposition W7, a good omnipotent thing exists. This is God. I emphasize this because it's a thing that atheists try to use to bring about a contradiction by holding that if a good omnipotent thing exists and evil exists, then there is contradiction. All that Dr. Matson has said comes down to those two statements. He is claiming a contradiction in those two statements. Proposition W8, it is not the case that there is a logical contradiction in the conjunction of Proposition W7 and Proposition W3. That is, that God, who is good and omnipotent, exists and evil exists. There is no contradiction in that, and he hasn't shown it to be so. His colleague in atheism, Dr. J.L. Mackey, recognized that is not immediately evident. Oh, Dr. Matson thinks it is. He says, oh, you can just see it. Dr. Mackey knew that it wasn't immediately evident, and he introduced quasi-logical rules to try to get it in there. Dr. Matson's argument on evil is simply not complete, as I showed you last evening. It is not the case, or in Proposition W9, this world is as good as any possible world for the purpose God had in creating it. That is, to be the ideal environment for soul making. It had to be a situation in which man could possibly have a tug or a persuasion toward God, that there would be evidence that could convince him that God is, that there could be a situation in which he could turn away from God. Otherwise, there would not be this real freedom. And this world is that ideal situation. I'm sorry I do not have the time to go into the details of it. In my book, to which Dr. Matson referred, I've given a great deal of detailed analysis of this matter, and it is an important matter. Proposition W10, every instance of human suffering results from some condition or conditions which was necessary to provide man with the ideal environment of soul making. The fact that we suffer in this world simply means that we are involved in a situation that God has given us. He created the world to be inhabited for a certain reason. Atheists object because the world doesn't fit the purpose they have in mind. They demand that earth be heaven, that it be a hedonic paradise. But earth is not heaven. This earth is not our home. As the Bible indicates in Hebrews 11, the wisdom of Sarah and Abraham, they dwelt in this earth as pilgrims, regarding themselves as merely passing through, looking for the city which hath the foundations, whose builder and maker is God. This earth is not heaven. It is a place to provide man with the one and only probationary period which he will ever have, to make up his mind what he will do about God. Dr. Matson said he's already made up his mind what he's going to do about it, and he'll take his chances. Dr. Matson, the Bible teaches the judgment day is coming, and I plead with you to be willing to consider the evidence to that end. Proposition W10A, God is not blameworthy for having created a world in which righteous and wicked persons suffer during earthly life. Sometimes men say, well, I would object to it if only the wicked suffer. But if the righteous suffer, then I cannot allow that. But God has recognized in his infinite wisdom that even the righteous need to live in this kind of place while we are in our probationary period. Proposition W10, God is not blameworthy for having created a world in which there seems to be, at least to some people, teleological suffering. That is, suffering which has no point. There is a way of explaining all instances of suffering in the light of the revelation which God has given us. Proposition W11, every instance of animal pain results from some condition or conditions which was necessary to providing man with the ideal environment of soul making. Even animal life has its place in this total picture. Proposition W12, every instance of natural calamities, tornadoes, earthquakes, and so forth. Dr. Matson calls these things evil, but they are not evil. They result from some condition which was necessary to providing man with the ideal environment of soul making. We live in a situation in which we realize our lives are in danger. We were thrilled by the shot to the moon because we realized those men were in danger. There's been absolutely no way they could have been hurt in any fashion. We would not have been thrilled by it. We realize every day we live in some way or other we may lose our lives. And so we walk, as it were, on the edge of eternity. And the Bible warns us in James chapter 4, verses 13 to 17. For what is your life? It is like a vapor that appeareth for the time, like a puff of smoke, and then vanisheth away. Proposition W13, man's earthly life is a probationary period, that is, during which his fate in eternity is settled, and it is his only probationary period. Proposition W14, man is immortal, that is, man will live on after physical death in a non-probationary period which is non-ending. Proposition W15, the stakes in eternity, the blessings of heaven and the punishment of hell are of such magnitude as to render all suffering in this life of no ultimate negative significance. Now, what is accomplished by these 22 propositions? If each of these 22 propositions is true, or even if it is even possible that they are true, then the atheistic effort to prove that theism necessarily involves a logical contradiction fails. Now bear in mind, this is the one and only effort that he has made, to say that God cannot exist because he envisions a logical contradiction between God and eternal punishment and evil in this world. Based upon what? Nothing but his own opinion, nothing but his own theory.
Ranting attempt to associate me with communism and the Khmer Rouge is not worthy of a reply. I would want to mention, though, that he has made another error in tactics in mentioning the frightful events in Cambodia at all, since this is certainly grist for the atheist's mill. The Khmer Rouge, communists, atheists, or whatever they are at any rate, on Dr. Warren's principles or beliefs, God's creatures, creatures whom God made in the full knowledge of what they would do. The main point in my argument this evening, to which Dr. Warren has paid, as you have seen, no attention whatsoever. I'll just use the last the few minutes that I have here, not in saying any more about this, but in summarizing once more my defense of my proposition, which is that the God who is perfectly wise, perfectly
debate.
Powerful, or that I know this. My contention is that that is a contradiction. My proof of it is as follows, and the contradiction is as follows. By the way, I never asked Dr. Warren for contradictions in writing. I just wanted to state them. Never mind. Well, premise one. Good is an evaluative term. We use good to grade things. Second premise. Nothing that brings about eternal pointless torment can be evaluated as good, no matter how lax the standards by which this evaluation is carried out may be. That's the second premise. The third premise is simply Dr. Warren's definition of God. A perfectly good being who inflicts eternal torments pointlessly. Well, inflicts eternal torments. Then I guess the fourth premise is mine, namely that these torments are pointless. So, if this were all written down, it would be clear. I think it should be even clearer as you listen to it. This description, good being who inflicts eternal torments, end quote, is a self-contradictory description. Therefore, by the logic that Dr. Warren and I both recognize, I think, being a self-contradictory description, it cannot apply to anything. Or, conclusion, in other words, no being fitting this description, or no Dr. Warren's God, can possibly exist. I hope that my support of all these propositions there is sufficiently clear in your memory. Tomorrow night, I suppose we will be taking up the question of the eighth mother of the human baby and other such goodies. Thank you very much for your attention, and good night.
Dr. Matson, ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to take, in spite of the fact that I need time to speak on various matters, I want to, because he's referred to this again and again, it's a very trivial matter, but I simply cannot allow him to get away with it. In the matter of his saying that this proposition is my proposition, as if something had been forced upon him, I read to you here from a letter from Gary Ely to Dr. Wallace Matson. A contact was first made to me about this debate, said, will you meet Dr. Wallace Matson in debate on this question as you did Dr. Flew? And I said, yes. What proposition should be submitted? I said on the telephone, submit the same propositions that Dr. Flew and I discussed. And so, in writing to Dr. Matson, Mr. Ely said this, I am writing to inquire of your interest in participating in a philosophical colloquium on the question of the existence of God. What we're interested in primarily is a debate between yourself holding to the strict atheistic proposition, I know that God does not exist, and a qualified theistic philosopher holding to the strict theistic proposition, I know that God does exist. Those are exactly the propositions of the flu debate. You can see that Mr. Ely contacted Dr. Matson. Will you debate these propositions, the same proposition that Dr. Warren debated with Dr. Flu? Then he says, if the proposition is not suitable, please suggest an alternative. If you're interested, please advise. Here is Dr. Matson's reply. There is a difficulty. I do not claim to know that God does not exist. And he has that in quotes, because that's the proposition. In other words, he's saying there's a difficulty with the proposition. My position is this: taking the word God to signify a unified being, distinct from nature, creating and controlling nature, and personal at least to the extent of having intentions that he, she, or it can express in a human language, I hold that A, the hypothesis of the existence of such a being is antecedently implausible, and B, no reasons known to me offered in support of the hypothesis suffice to make it plausible. If that is close enough to the strict atheistic proposition, for your purposes, it certainly rules out the God of the Nicene Creed, I might be interested in participating in your colloquium. So, in an effort to try to satisfy Dr. Matson, the suggestion was then made to him and to me that we discuss this proposition. Dr. Matson, is the matter now clear in your mind that it was instigated because of your objection to the flu propositions and not because of mine? Now we were treated in the last 5 minutes to simply the same statement over and over. There has nothing been said by Dr. Matson but this: God is perfectly wise, God is infinite in power, but he cannot be good because anything that brings about eternal punishment cannot be good. Why? Because Wallace Matson says so. He says it doesn't matter what basis you have for alleging that. You just know that it's the case. Friends, that's nothing in the world but a subjective opinion. Let's look at chart 36U9, which is the counter element of mine, the basic affirmation of theism. I've been explaining to you now the propositions that are involved in the total picture of the argument from evil. Dr. Matson has not taken these up in a systematic way. He jumped here and there, and now and again would tell you you can just see that it's evil. And he cannot disassociate himself from the Khmer Rouge. He cannot disassociate himself from their basic atheistic doctrine. And the fact that they are creatures of God means only that if they live in disobedience to God, then they will be lost. But they have the opportunity of being saved just as does everyone else. Let us notice down at the bottom of the page, since we have so little time, if atheism is true, then subjectivity is true. If there is no God, then we're all here by accident, just sheer chance. Non-living matter. Then living matter. Dr. Matson said it couldn't come about by spontaneous generation. No wonder he doesn't want to talk about evolution. But if that's all we are, then subjectivity is true. That means your opinion is as good as mine, mine's as good as yours. You can contradict me, I can contradict you, and you'd have to say we're both right. If subjectivity is true, then one can say murder is right and the other can say murder is wrong, but it's false to say that murder is right and murder is wrong. That's a logical contradiction. The law of contradiction itself says it's false to say that the same proposition is both true and false. Therefore, by modus tollens, we have a deduction from propositions 2 and 3, which brings us to the point that subjectivity is false. Then from 1 and 4, if subjectivity is false and it is implied by atheism, then atheism itself is false. Now I have shown that theism is true. I have shown that atheism is false. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Matson, Dr. Warren. Let me remind the audience that tomorrow night, propositions, the obligation of our disputants will change. Proposition tomorrow evening, Dr. Warren being in the affirmative reads, I know that God, that is the God of the New Testament, who is to punish some individual eternally in hell, does exist. It will be Dr. Warren's obligation to put forth evidence that demands that conclusion. It will be Dr. Matson's obligation to listen to this and to negate it.
There's been some question regarding the order blanks and if the debate is being printed, if there will be tapes. Some have come in late and not heard this. The order blanks are available on the stand here on either side, and also the ushers will provide you with these as you exit. Some of you are already leaving. If you have not got this and desire to, there's a pre-publication price that's available. Please read the certificate or the order blank very carefully in order to take advantage of that. This time, if there's nothing else, we stand dismissed until tomorrow evening.